You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Hey folks, happy Thursday. We've made it almost to the end of the week. I want to welcome you to my show. This is Scotty Roberts. I am the host of the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com if you want to come over and listen to the audio version of this show. And at the same time, you can join my YouTube channel and watch the video simulcast of the show, along with the live chat room filled with Intrepids. That conversation's already starting over there right now. So come on over and join that lively bunch at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we've been talking about the Exodus, we've been talking about Moses, we've been talking about the magic of ancient Egypt, and how the Exodus, even though it's a biblical story, an Old Testament tale, it's a story that reflects a lot of Egyptian magic in its in the story itself. And I think this is important to recognize, is that Moses would have grown up in Egypt, as we've mentioned many times. He grew up in Egypt for the first 40 years of his life, schooled in the school of the nobles. He was being groomed very possibly to be the next Pharaoh. But he was Grand Vizier, made Grand Vizier by Hatshepsut, the female Pharaoh who reigned for a little over 20 years in Egypt. I believe she was also the woman who found him in the Nile when she was very young. There were only about 7 to 10 years difference in age. But around the time that Senenmut, who I believe was Moses, that guy over there over my shoulder, that bust right there, that Senenmut was the biblical Moses. And we might get to that tonight. Again, I know we've talked about that when we talked about my book with John Ward on the Exodus reality, and all the talking I've done on Moses and Senenmut and so on. But there's a little different version of the same character that we might get to tonight. I'm pretty sure we'll hit it. And tonight I just want to go through the rest of the plagues of Egypt, which we started yesterday, and the parting of the Red Sea, which is where we ended last night, and how these all fit into Egyptian magic, and tales of ancient Egyptian magic. The heka being the magic, the heka being the staff of Moses. Now remember the passage in Exodus 14. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now remember, we also talked a couple of times in the past about there being a geological event which can part the waters of the sea to the north of the Red Sea, the Bitter Lakes, the Sea of Reeds, and how it's because it's shallow and those strong east winds come off of the Negev down below Israel, and they blow over into Egypt and the Sinai, and they have the effect of drying off the upper elevations beneath the water, and it looks like you're crossing on dry ground. And when those winds stop, that water can come raging back in, almost like a low tsunami. And so finally, after the Israelites had passed, the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians. Now, it's been noted for a very long time, over a century, that this narrative contains nearly identical motifs to older Egyptian tales, from the same Westcar papyrus we mentioned last night as the tale of the wax crocodile. Remember that one? Onus and the tale of the wax crocodile. We read another story of a lector priest named Jejemonk, or Zuzamonk, however you want to pronounce that, the D-J-E monk. In this story, Pharaoh Snefru parts the waters when one of his women accompanying him dropped a necklace. Now, consider how familiar that story sounded to the Exodus scene. And we showed a painting last night from the tomb of Ramses IV, which shows parting of waters. Now, when Moses extends his arm over the sea and he commands his followers to be still and quiet, that's Exodus 14:14 and through verse 16, Nagel, a historian, notes that he's mirroring ancient rituals known to herders who needed to ford rivers. In several tomb scenes from the Old Kingdom, now we're talking 2350 BCE and beyond backwards, this is about 1,000 years before the dating of the Exodus, we see lector priests assisting animal herders in fording crocodile-filled waters. And in some of the scenes, they sit at the back of the boat, and they hold their staff, they recite magical words, and while in others, they stand on the shore holding their staves, commanding the boatmen to be quiet, be still, exactly like Moses did. You need only to be still, Moses told the Israelites. So even more interesting is that these magical words are commanded to be kept secret, not to be revealed to anyone outside the house of life. And this suggests that these herder magicians were in fact high-ranking lector priests who could, via magical staffs and commandments, assist herders in fording dangerous waterways. Now, Moses seems to fulfill this exact role when he herds his flock of people across the sea, using similar techniques as the herding magicians. And so, what you see here in this story is, now Moses, if he had penned this book like we think he did, he is referring to ancient Egyptian stories that he would have learned growing up of the lector magicians who would take their staves and hold them across the waters and part waters so shepherds could cross their flocks. And in many older paintings of Moses at sea, we see him with mysteriously pointing his finger toward the raging waters. And this was, of course, the same exact magical gesture that was often employed by lector priests who wished to calm troubled waters. Now, Moses' indomitable spirit is perhaps best brought to life in the Ten Commandments, even though it's an old, gorgeous Technicolor movie. And by the way, you watch it on DVD, you watch it on TV, you don't get the impact of what Technicolor was. I once saw the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston way back in the early 80s. They were reviving some of the old Technicolor movies from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and showing them on the big screens at some theaters at limited engagements. And I saw the Ten Commandments, I saw at the Fox Theater in downtown Detroit. And you see that movie in its bold, beautiful, gorgeous Technicolor. It's like nothing you've seen on DVD or on television. It was a gorgeous movie, by the way. But Charlton Heston in that movie proudly proclaims, "The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand," Charlton Heston cries out as Moses. And this comes directly from the biblical passage. In the Song of the Sea, we read of the Lord's right hand being majestic in power, and the power of his arm. Now, these phrases derive from the Bronze Age Egypt. As Hoffmeyer, historian, we mentioned him the last couple of nights, explains in his Israel in Egypt, 1996, the terms strong hand or Yad Hasaka, it's Hazaqah, Yad Hasaka. The outstretched arm or the Zeroa Netuya, used in the Pentateuch, correspond to the Egyptian terms HPS, hips, or strong arm, and PRA, or the arm extended. These phrases, now this is linguistics, but this is interesting when you find the comparisons. These phrases are later used in Deuteronomy 26, verse 8. "And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with deeds of terror and signs of wonders." And so there is all these linguistic comparisons as well to ancient Egyptian spells and magics. There's an interesting idea that was suggested by Nagel, concerns the Lord battling for the Israelites. In Exodus 14:14, Moses proclaims this. He says, "The Lord will fight for you." This relationship has been compared by Nagel to that of the lector priest and his great fighter priest, or the Ahawa. And they would assist in the lector by magically cutting up the Apophis serpent and fighting the forces of evil and chaos in general. Now compare the similar roles that Moses as lector priest and fording magician, with the Lord Yahweh as his fighter priest equivalent, for Yahweh as described in Exodus 15:3 as a man of war or a warrior. Even further Egyptian parallels emerge when considering the execration texts of Egypt. Lists of Pharaoh's enemies written on pottery that was then smashed, burnt, and otherwise mutilated in ritual magics designed to curse those enemies. And these appear all throughout Egyptian history and were a vital magical part of priestly duties. So similar execration language is used to describe Yahweh, Jehovah's treatment of the enemy Egyptians in the Song of the Sea that Moses composes after their miraculous escape. In Exodus 15:6-7, you find this: "Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you smashed your opponents. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble." Now, in this song, Moses turns the magical practices used by the Egyptians on their enemies against them, suggesting that they were smashed, shattered, and burnt, instead of the execration text, where they would take a piece of pottery, they'd take a cup or a mug like this, and they'd inscribe the curse to their enemy, and then they'd smash it. That was the curse upon the enemy. And further Egyptian examples can be found in this ancient song, the Bible's oldest preserved text dating to 1200 BCE. These include God blowing on the sea, swallowing his enemies, creating terror and fear in his opponents. All common execration text themes. For Nagel translates some of these as "fear of you circulates in their hearts, and his terror circulates in their hearts." So even the pattern of the execration in the Song of the Sea follows the Egyptian template. Consider the Egyptian. It says this: "See that foe who has come to break your house, to ruin your gate? O Osiris, see that the foe who has said, sore be the pains of your suffering which are on you. May you break and overthrow your foes and set them under your sandals." Now look at the comparison to Exodus 15:9 and 10. "The foe said, I will pursue, I will overtake them, I will divide the spoils, I will gorge myself on them, I will draw my sword and my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them." Now, one last point on this concerns the ultimate fate of the pursuing Egyptian army. Remember, it was always said that Pharaoh and his armies were destroyed in the Red Sea. I happen to think Pharaoh survived, especially when you look at historically. I believe the Pharaoh was Amenhotep II. By the way, this might be a good place to insert that, and we've talked about this in the past, but if you haven't heard this before, you see in the movies all the time and in storybooks Ramses II as being the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, Ramses lived and reigned around the middle 1200s BCE. However, the dating system of the Bible, if you put it into the Egyptian Chronicle of Kings and other events, you find the Exodus probably took place 200 years before the time that Ramses II was on the throne. And that would have been under the reign of Amenhotep II in the mid-1440s BCE. Now, a lot of people who believe that Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, they base it on verses in the book of Exodus which state, "And the Israelites built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses." Now, these were cities that were built by Ramses II. So, if the Israelites built his treasure cities, they must have been in Egypt underneath his rule, correct? No, not when you consider a couple of different things. And this is an aside I'm taking here from the parting of the Red Sea story, is that remember when Israel was carried off into captivity many years after the Exodus. We're talking 600s BCE, thereabouts. Babylon carries them off, takes them all captive, burns down the temple, and destroys everything. Well, after the return, Israel sent 72 priests, 72 scribes, to the library at Alexandria, and they got permission from the Pharaoh, Ptolemy II, who was the Ptolemaic Pharaoh, to come to the Library of Alexandria, the great Library of Alexandria, for a purpose of restructuring the Hebrew texts, the Torah, the Bible, the Old Testament as they would have known it. And this is because they were all destroyed. They only had their oral traditions. And so they went to the Library of Alexandria, where there were copies of all these old scrolls. And they sat there and they reconstructed the entirety of the Old Testament as we know it today, up to the, the minor prophets and some of those who were later after them, who came after them. But those texts were reconstructed, and they wrote it in the common language of the day of commerce, which was Hellenized Greek, Koine Greek, and they wrote the Septuagint, was the collection of all the Old Testament books. And this is what, if you pick up a Bible today and look at the Old Testament, the Septuagint is what you're reading. That is the Greek, or the Septuaginta, some people call it. That is what they composed. And when they composed this, they found some of the texts. They used oral traditions, but there were also gaps in history that appear in the text because of this. And so when you see the account of Moses, either Moses, one, deliberately left out all the Pharaoh's names for a purpose, and that was, I think, there was a combination of things, but I think it was to state the name was to give them life, which was an Egyptian spiritual practice, and so he left the names out. At the same time, I don't think they knew 1,000 years after it happened they had any more recollection of when exactly these events took place, who exactly the pharaohs were, and so on, and so you see some changes. And what you see is that the Hebrews, the Israelites, as stated in Exodus, built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, which Ramses II built those cities. Now here's the other thing to take into consideration, is that because of this 1,000-year gap, the transmission of history, historical data, it was missed that the Israelites, or that Ramses II built the cities of Pithom and Ramses, but they were reconstructions of existing cities. What the Israelites built was the original city, the city of Avaris. And Avaris is in that Goshen territory in the Nile Delta region. And so when Ramses II rebuilt or reclaimed Avaris for himself, which Ramses II was great at, he was the great usurper of temples, of monuments, and everything, where he scraped out everybody else's name and put his own name on them. He reconstructed or glorified this old city of Avaris and built Pi-Ramses. Now, Avaris is the city that the Israelites would have built a few hundred years before the time of Ramses II. And in excavations at Avaris, which were wiped pretty clean, it's all under a cornfield. You go there now, it's a cornfield. You don't see anything that reminds you of ruins. But they did do some excavation work there, and they had to cover it back up. And what they found were a lot of Semitic earmarks to those ruins, Semitic peoples from the Canaanite region. And so it's very interesting that nowadays you find scholars always saying, because the Bible said the Hebrews built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh Ramses II, that's not the city. They built the original city, and Ramses reclaimed it and refurbished it, so to speak, under his own reign. So this is what you have with Ramses. So when you talk about the ultimate fate of the pursuing Egyptian army and the death of the Pharaoh, well, number one, even if it had been Ramses lived for much longer throughout his reign, but it wasn't Ramses, so get him out of the picture. It was Amenhotep II, 200 years earlier. Amenhotep II, the Exodus would have taken place in and around the 5th year of his reign, but we know he reigned for 23 years. But there's an interesting thing, and I mentioned this yesterday. Remember, Amenhotep II had 5 successful military campaigns in the first 5 years of his reign, from the time he was 18 years old until he was 23 years old. He had 5 successful military campaigns. And around the time he was 23 is when the Exodus would have fit into the dating system. What's very interesting, it was almost 10 more years after the dating of the Exodus that he went on any successful or any military campaigns. Why is this? Perhaps the loss and destruction of his entire army in the Sea of Reeds at the parting of the Red Sea. So that's conjecture, but there it is. I'm going to throw that on you. So once the Israelites cross on dry land on what I believe was the Reed Sea, and I'll show you a map in the second segment, I'll call it up, of where I believe this was. Moses commands the waters to collapse on the Egyptian soldiers, drowning all of them. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. The army of Pharaoh, not Pharaoh himself. Now, the Egyptians viewed drowning as a noble death, and Herodotus, 4th century BCE historian, claims that when anyone is known to have drowned by the river itself, his body is deemed something more than human and is handled and buried by the priests of the Nile themselves. That's from his Histories, Book 2. And this is supported by several Egyptian funerary texts, specifically the Anduat, and the 10th hour in the Book of Gates, and the 9th gate, both of which portray drowned soldiers afloat in the river. The accompanying text reads, "You are those who are within the Nun, the drowned who are the following. May life belong to your Baz." And these soldiers were ultimately redeemed to eternal life. And there's some contradictions in this, though. Rensburg makes it very clear. The biblical author plays by the Egyptians' rules, whereby inanimate objects may be transformed into crocodiles. The death of the firstborn is an important theme. Waters can be divided in order to restore joy to the royal family. Death by drowning is honorific, and more. The biblical author subverts all of these notions as he leads his readers through sustained narratives. And if he's indeed correct, then we can best understand the Passover tales of Magick as subverting expected Egyptian norms to favor the underdogs, Moses and the Israelites. Everyone loves a good underdog story. And Moses the magician lived through and then chronicled one of history's greatest magical events. Now we're going to stop there for the first segment. We'll be back in a couple of minutes, and I want to pick up right where we left off on this. So you sit tight. saying welcome back. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, come on over and join the live chat room and the live video broadcast of this program on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the other Intrepids in the lively conversations that are going on right now in the chat room as this show plays. So, thanks for being here. This is segment 2. We're going to pick up. We were talking about the parting of the Red Sea, the death of the armies of Pharaoh in the Red Sea, and Passover is the most important holiday in Judaism. It's a week to remember its foundational event, the miraculous escape of the Israelites under Moses from bondage in Egypt. Now, yes, escape. Pharaoh let them go, or somebody let them go. Maybe it was Rechmir, the Pharaoh in place of Pharaoh, the Grand Vizier, as we discussed yesterday, that possibility. This is why Pharaoh seems to question, where have all my slaves gone? Because Rechmir let them go, perhaps? We do notice after this date that Rechmir is no longer heard of in Egyptian history. But moving on, by placing the event into the historical context of the late Bronze Age, we can better understand the role of the magic that's played in the drama of the time. Passover seems to contain so much magic because it's first emerged during a time of ubiquitous magic in the world. Everyone used it, respected it, told stories of it. If anything, Passover's resounding magical themes attest to its great antiquity. They also argue that Moses himself was intimately familiar with and influenced by the magical tales of the lector priests. He was probably schooled in this in the school of the nobles as he was growing up. And perhaps he was one himself. Remember, Hatshepsut gave him 92 different royal titles, from Grand Vizier to the Grand Royal Architect to the High Priest of Amun, and on down the line. So these magicians lived in direct contact with the gods of Egypt. Moses is known for having this exact type of direct contact with Yahweh, who spoke to him in Deuteronomy 34:10 face to face as a man talks to his friend. This was Moses. Remember, we've talked about this before. Moses writes, "And God met with me in my tent, and I met with him face to face, as a man talks to his friend." Yet 9 verses later in the same chapter, he says, "And no man can see God's face and live." Well, what did he mean by this contradiction? I think the contradiction was obvious. Moses, in the Egyptian style or fashion or way of doing things, as the leader of this ragtag nation of slaves, former slaves, he's the leader of the nation. What was the Pharaoh? The Pharaoh was a god who communed with the gods. The lector priests were minor gods who communed with the gods. I believe Moses really brought this belief system into his practice as the leader of Israel. And it comes down and it kind of bites him in the ass later on. But with his hands held high at the sea, Moses was mirroring the very image of Heka. The greatest practitioner of Heka in Egypt was Pharaoh. And by directly confronting and even defeating him, Moses proved to the world that he was a magician equally as powerful, and that maybe he had even once been a pharaoh or groomed for the pharaohship himself. And at any rate, he believed himself to be something greater than just an ordinary guy. And I think we can all attest to that part anyway, at least in part. Now, I want to show you an image here of, this is something I had talked about yesterday, and I didn't have the image called up. Here is an image of this area I was speaking of. Now, look, this is a map I created for our book, The Exodus Reality. John Ward's in my book. And what I'm trying to show here, first of all, if you look way down to the south, You can see the Nile River running from, you see the Nile Delta way up in the top up here, and the Nile River runs all the way down to the bottom. And you see Thebes, which is current-day Luxor. This is where all the old temples are. This is where John Ward, amongst others, believed the Exodus took place in several different parts anyway from the city of Thebes. Now, if they would have done that, you see they would have had to cross the eastern desert and come up to the Red Sea, which at those points in the Red Sea are very vastly wide. Now, however, I believe that the Exodus took place from Goshen. Look way up to the north now. Up here. Where's my fingers? Right there. The Nile Delta region. You got the Mediterranean to the north. You got the Nile Delta. And at the tip of the bottom of the Nile Delta, you've got Mennefer, which is Memphis, current-day Memphis. And just north of that, Memphis is about 30 miles south of Cairo. So Cairo is all at that convergence of the Nile Delta. Now, just to the east of Cairo and a bit to the north is what the area, the region called Goshen. This is where the Israelites had settled. And I want to show you something here if I blow this up. And let's do this way. We'll grab it, and I'm going to blow this up a little bigger so you can kind of see what's going on here. All right. So if you've got the city of Mennefer there in the lower left, that's Memphis, and Cairo just north of that, and you can see Giza off to the left of the river. That's the Giza Plateau with the pyramids and the Sphinx. You've got Goshen up in the northeast of Cairo, what is now Cairo. You can see, and I wish I had a pointer here, but just below Goshen it says Wadi Tumilat. Now the Wadi Tumilat is a wadi, it's a wash where once a year it might fill with water, but it was also a trade route. You can look at go to Google Earth and look at Egypt, and you can see this green swath here of the Wadi Tumilat. Now, if the Hebrews lived in Goshen, and the summer palaces are in Mennefer, it says that Moses would meet with Pharaoh, and that the same day he would meet with the leaders of the slaves, of the Israelites, up in Goshen. And that's about a 30-mile trek, and by water on the Nile, which is running north, you could go up pretty fast. You could get up there, and then all the canals and channels that were dug. So the Wadi Tumilat, when the Exodus took place, I believe they left from Goshen. They followed the Wadi Tumilat, the trade route, and they ended up to the north of what you see here, right in the middle of the page, the Sea of Reeds. Now, if I were to move this up, you'd see that this is the Red Sea right here. That left branch is the Red Sea. And the Sea of Reeds is the shallow lakes or the bitter lakes. And now from the very tip, just below where you see I've got the word Sea of Reeds, just below that would be the tip of the northern tip of the Red Sea. And that's also where the Suez Canal begins. And the Suez Canal runs through all of this and up to the Mediterranean in present day. Now you also see, by the way, over here, to the lower left, you see Serebet el-Khadim. This is the mountain that I believe, and John Ward believes, we wrote about it in our book, that's the mountain of God. That's the Mount Sinai. Now, way over to the far right of the Sinai Peninsula there, that's where they believe St. Catherine's is, down a little bit to the south and east of this. But I believe it was Serebet el-Khadim. And so they would have traveled across the Wadi Tumilat, crossed the waters of the Sea of Reeds, which I believe you've got to Canaan up here in Syria. This is the Negev up in the upper right. And that's where those strong east winds would blow and part those waters. And so they came down onto the Sinai side, followed down the eastern shore of the Red Sea, and turned inland to Serebet el-Khadim, all in about 2 weeks' time. So that's the map I was talking to you about, and that's the Sea of Reeds. So this miracle man, Moses, a lector priest, probably a former Pharaoh in grooming, he utilized and mimicked and sometimes mocked the magics of Egypt. So I want to move on a little bit from the magics of Egypt, and I want to talk about something I've talked about before, something that was in our book here, the Exodus Reality. John Ward and I wrote this book back in 2013. It was published, and it's a fun book. If you don't have it, it's rife with pictures and we've got all these color sections in there, and I'm going to show you some stuff from that as well. But that was our book. And on the Exodus, looking for the historical Moses and the historical Exodus. And you've heard me talk about this before, but there was a question that's been out there. Has the biblical Moses actually been identified in the secular Egyptian records? Remember, Moses was a prophet and a leader according to the Abrahamic religions, but many scholars view him as a legendary figure rather than a real historic person. I believe he was a real guy. John Ward, in our book, we had two different views that we presented. He believed that Moses was a guy, but he was more an archetype and not the man himself. And they do concede that a Moses-like figure could have existed in history. So is it possible to track this person down through historic records? And it's the view of me and some of the notes here I've got from some other writers that it's very possible that Moses is identifiable. I don't think there's any reason to believe he wasn't a real guy. In fact, Moses' figure can be traced as that of the primary confidant of none other than Egyptian Pharaoh Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh of Egypt in the 18th dynasty, and the trail begins with the Exodus. And the Exodus and Moses' birth, what's the date of the Exodus? And to find Moses in the Egyptian records, the first requirement is to fix the date of the Exodus. Now, if we use the Bible as a primary source for dating, we know that this occurred during the New Kingdom period of Egypt, when the powerful Egyptian families of the south reasserted themselves and drove out the Hyksos invaders. That took place a couple of 100 years before the events of the Exodus. They had been in power for 100 years, and I believe Joseph, I've talked about this before, Joseph came into power as a grand vizier during the time of the Hyksos. And the Hyksos stay in Egypt is better known in history as the Second Intermediate Period. And there's a difference of opinion among biblical scholars as to when, during the New Kingdom, the Exodus occurred. So can we find anything that helps us pin it down? If one accepts the biblical dating of Solomon's time, and we know that he started building his famous temple in 960 BCE, and the text of 1 Kings 6, verse 1, look it up in your Bible, states that this was 480 years since the Exodus, when Solomon laid the founding cornerstones for the temple in Jerusalem in 960. Thus, we can fix a date for the Exodus of around 1440 to 1445 BCE, when Moses was about 80 years old, according to the story. Now, this would mean that he was born around 1520. I've got him at 1526, and the Exodus at 1446, by all these dating systems we bring together. And that he was an adult in the court of Egypt between 1500 and 1480. Now, where does the name Moses come from? From 1500 to 1480 BCE is the time of the Pharaoh queen Hatshepsut. And she had a close confidant described by the well-known Egyptologist Joyce Tidesley in her book on Hatshepsut as the greatest of the great. The father of Hatshepsut was Tutmosis I, and his name means son of Thoth, the god of wisdom, Morse meaning son. Meaning son, Moses. And this is a common use of the word Moses as in Ramses. Ramses is Ra-Moses. Amos is Amoses. Ramses was Ra, Moses, the son of the god Ra. So the biblical text tells us that it was the Pharaoh's daughter who named Moses. And she states that she called him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. But we won't find a Prince Moses in the court of Egypt anywhere, because another biblical reference, Hebrews 11, verse 24, states that Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, instead, we find that the close confidant of the queen is a man called Senenmut. That guy right there over my shoulder, that bust right there. And this appears to be a unique name, and one of its meanings is mother's brother. Hatshepsut was born in the early 1530s, so they were very close in age, so such a nickname makes sense, or a name makes sense. Why would the royal heiress adopt a slave child? Now, if Hatshepsut is indeed the woman who rescued and adopted Moses, and I believe she was, her name was Matkare before her regnal name Hatshepsut when she took power. But she was the Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter was a title in Egypt. So when Moses, in the book of Exodus, talks about Pharaoh's daughter, that's actually a title, like Pharaoh itself. And Matkari would have been 7 to 10 years old at this time. If it was she who actually rescued and adopted Moses, what would make a woman of such high standing adopt a slave child? After her mother, Hatshepsut was the highest woman in the land, and such a woman could not consider saving a life of a slave child, let alone adopt him as her son. But when we look at the past, it's hard for us to remember that the people we are observing are just like us. They have thoughts, they have feelings like us. And Hatshepsut, at the time she found the abandoned baby in the basket, was a little girl with the instincts to protect a child. He was crying, and she took pity on him, Exodus 2:6 says. And Hatshepsut knew that he was a Hebrew child, as the rest of the verse tells us. But she was too young to look ahead and understand the enormity of this action, of adopting a child. So almost immediately, she must have formed an attachment to him, and as he grew, the attachment grew, and her loyalty to him would alter the course of her life. And remember, the biblical text also says she gave him back to his sister, who followed along to see what happened with the basket, and let him be weaned by his mom until he was old enough to come into the palace and live with her. So what do we know of Hatshepsut? We know that she married her brother, Thutmose II, becoming his great royal wife, his principal queen. She bore him 2 daughters but no sons. And following Thutmose II's death, after a reign of only 13 years, his son by a harem woman is made the Pharaoh. And that's Thutmose III, who we've mentioned before. But he was only about 3 to 6 years old at the time of his father's death. Now, the new Pharaoh is not much more than a toddler. And Hatshepsut is made regent with him. And she really pushed the case that my father, Thutmose I, wanted me to reign. And so she took the reins of the kingdom, and she made herself Pharaoh. And she is effectively the ruler of the land, even though she's a co-regent with the young 3-year-old boy. And she holds all the power already, and so it seems odd to Egyptians that just after 2 years, she actually makes herself the Pharaoh. And she sends Thutmose III up to the palaces in the north at Memphis. And he grows up. He actually becomes the general of all her armies. He never tries to overthrow her. There's never a coup attempt. I'm sure that there were factions in the palace, but he doesn't try to overthrow her at all. I think she had a very peaceful kingdom. Did she have ambitions to put her adopted son on the throne? No. This Moses, who she drew out of the Nile? This she could do if she were Pharaoh, but not if she were only regent. So she reigns as the senior Pharaoh, jointly with Thutmose III for 22 successful years until her death. And she rules the country very well. She sets up trading expeditions with the lands of south of Egypt. She keeps a firm grip on Nubia, Egypt's southern neighbor, from which vast resources are acquired, including gold, cattle, slaves, and soldiers. And by the way, I made a joke last night with Field Guy over in the chat room. You were talking about always punt or never punt. And I said, that's what Hatshepsut said. And you may not have caught it. That was a historical reference and play on words, because her big expedition to Punt, or Punt, P-U-N-T, same spelling, brought in all these riches for the land of Egypt. And she carries out extensive building works, both in Waset, and the ancient name for Luxor, and around the country. And she extends the temple of Amun in Waset, erecting 4 huge obelisks in his honor, 2 of which are still there. I've gone there, I've touched them. One is still standing, and it bears engravings as clear as they were when it was erected 3,500 years ago, reading, "Raised for the glory of my father Amun, that I may be given life." And she builds a magnificent mortuary temple for herself, where the gods are honored, known as the Temple of Deir el-Bahre, which still stands and is visited by thousands every year. I've been there several times, and it's a magnificent temple. I've talked about that place. So, what happened to Hatshepsut's memory after her death? Hatshepsut ruled her country well and was buried honorably, probably with her father, Thutmose I, in tomb KV-20 in the Valley of the Kings. And after the death of his stepmother, Thutmose III, who was the co-regent, the child who was named Pharaoh, he took over as Pharaoh in his rightful place. And he had a long reign of over 50 years. And he went to the throne roughly around age 25 well, if he was 3, he would have been 25 at the time of Hatshepsut's death. And he spent much of his time campaigning in the Levant. He defeated the power of the Hittites to the northwest, and he had many military campaigns. But 30 years after her death, all records of Hatshepsut came under attack. Her statues were removed from all the temples, smashed and buried in a pit. Her reliefs were excised from the walls of the temples, and in subsequent years Hatshepsut's name was omitted from the king's list, a thing done to no other pharaoh except the great heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, but not to one previous female pharaoh, Sobonefru, who reigned briefly at the end of the 12th dynasty. Now, removing all of Hatshepsut's name was intended by the Egyptians as the ultimate punishment, and she was forgotten for a very long time. And I believe it was Amenhotep II, the son of Thutmose III, who had a lot of hatred for his former stepmother, and he removed all her names from everything. And also at the same time, in this pit where her statues were buried 9 statues of Senenmut. So the big question still remains, who would have tried to remove Hatshepsut from history? Why would they have buried her statues? Why would they have eradicated her images? Why would they have also, at the same time, tried to eradicate the memory of Senenmut? Why was this done? And who would have done it, and what would his motivations have been? The actions against Hatshepsut's and Senenmut's memory occurs either late in the reign of Thutmose III, when he's pushing like 80 years old, when his son Amenhotep II was sharing the throne, or after Thutmose's death, when Amenhotep II was reigning alone. Now remember, Amenhotep II was 18 when he came co-regent with his father, 23 when he was at the time of the Exodus. I believe he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And so in that first 5 years, sometimes it seemed that this took place. And it seems, therefore, to be Amenhotep II who is responsible for the destruction of all this imagery. Why would he want their names wiped out? He would be at the correct time to see the return of Moses, demanding the release of Hebrew slaves. Senenmut returned as Moses. The story of the Exodus describes great hardship for Egypt, and one can understand Amenhotep's fury against both Hatshepsut and Senenmut, wishing, pardon me while I adjust my mic. I had moved my mic up, and hopefully it's not making too many nasty noises. One can understand Amenhotep's fury against both Hatshepsut and Senenmut, wishing to destroy their memory. Wiping them out of history for the Egyptians was tantamount to eternal damnation. So, when were Hatshepsut's statues discovered? What did they reveal? During the 1800s, wealthy gentlemen such as James Breasted, who wrote several historical books on Egypt, went to Egypt specifically with the hope of finding evidence to prove the biblical record. And these men effectively established the science of Egyptology. But at that time, the statues of Hatshepsut still lay buried in a pit where they were thrown 30 years after her death. They remained there undiscovered until found by Herbert Winlock, an American Egyptologist employed by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Boston, in the United States, in 1927, by which time the world at large was no longer interested in trying to prove the Bible. But not only was a hoard of statues of Hatshepsut discovered just east of the first court of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahre, another pit was found, containing over 20 hard stone statues of Senenmut. A huge number for a non-royal, in fact. To date, 26 hard stone statues of Senenmut have been identified, which causes Egyptologists to wonder what it was about this man that he was given such status, that he would have so much statuary about him. So what do we know about Senenmut in quick? The first thing to confront us when looking at the records of Senenmut are the many beautiful statues of him as a young lad holding Hatshepsut's elder daughter, the Princess Nefruri. She's there wrapped in his cloak as a baby as he sits on the ground. He's holding her in his arms the way a woman would hold a child. In some examples, he sits in a chair, holding her on his lap. Some are of him standing holding Nefruri as a toddler, but altogether they show this level of intimacy between the two of them as we would have in photos taken of our children together, like this statue here. It's a replica, but you can see the small head here is Nefruri, the princess, that Senenmut is embracing. And so he's said to have been the tutor to Nefruri. But statues of a royal child being held like this had never been made before this date, especially not of a tutor. And in this breaking of this protocol, because a non-royal is not allowed to touch a royal child in any way, we know that Senenmut is not royal because he names his parents in one of his tombs, and they have no titles at all. They were commoners of humble origin, perhaps slave origin. But the extraordinary thing about Senenmut is that he is treated as a royal. And you know what? We've got to wrap it up now for today. We're going to pick this up where we left off. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about Senenmut I want to get into. And so, guys, you sit tight for 23 hours. We'll be back with a lot more fun and